Hello and welcome to the Christ and Culture webcast. I'm your host, Taylor DeSoto. Today we will be reading yet another article, and that's probably what I'm going to be doing on this channel for a little bit, just getting my articles out into video content. Maybe give some people some stuff to watch other than election coverage, which I think is probably going to be nice for most people. I think a lot of people are a little bit fatigued with politics, and so let's talk textual criticism instead. Maybe that'll be helpful for people. Anyway, I'm going to be reading an article called "Is the CBGM God's Gift to the Church?" It's stated by some that the coherence-based genealogical method, or the CBGM, is a blessing to God's church, even gifted to the church by God, by way of God's providence. I thought it would be helpful to examine this claim. Unfortunately, those who have made such statements regarding the Editio Critica Maior, known as the ECM, and the CBGM, have not seemed to provide an answer as to why this is the case. This is often a challenge in the textual discussion. Assertions and claims can be helpful to understanding what someone believes, but oftentimes these assertions fall short in explaining why they believe something to be true. Somebody can say, "This is the case." No evidence, no argument, simply blanket assertions, really common in the discussion of textual criticism. The closest explanation that I have heard as to why the CBGM is a blessing to God's church is because it has been said that it can detail the exact form of the Bible as it existed around 125 AD. Again, this is simply an assertion and needs to be demonstrated. And there's something, I think, kind of as a side note, that Christians really need to examine when they are so willing to just adopt a position because their trusted scholar or trusted YouTube personality or whatever just kind of says something. And you just trust them and you base their authority, you base that trust in their authority. Well, this person hasn't let me down before, therefore I can trust them. Well, that's good, especially if they're your pastor. We're required to be a little bit more investigative than that. If somebody says that, let's just say the water never falls to room temperature, it can't. And this, maybe someone read something that was wrong, and they're just repeating it in their authority you trust, and you just believe them. Well, water does in fact fall to room temperature. There's a certain investigative process that we should all follow when we hear any assertion, and we shouldn't go after that assertion with any assumption. We just say, okay, well, where's your source? Where did you get that from? And rather than trying to find an alternative argument to what they said, go and look it out and see what they're saying. There's just a lack of that in a lot of ways today. So, and I think a lot of scholars and apologists know that they do this. I think the academic class has become increasingly postmodern and increasingly either dishonest or malicious or perhaps just ignorant. I honestly think the academy in general is making people so learned that they actually know nothing. And anyway, that's my little tangent on, the sort of appeals to authority. Appeals to authority have their place, but we have to be a little bit more scrutinous of things. So in this article, I thought that it would be helpful to provide a simple explanation of what the CBGM is. And I believe Pastor Tanner Dyken has a whole video. I might try to link it in the description if I can find it. And how the anyway, in this article, I'm going to talk about what the CBGM is at a basic level, how it's being used, and the impact that the CBGM will have on Bibles going forward, and then maybe you can discern for yourselves if it's a blessing to the church. If there's enough interest in this video or in this article, maybe I can write a little bit more about the CBGM later. And oftentimes you've heard, well, the TR guys, they don't know anything about the CBGM. It's like, that's just simply not true. And we overall, at least the people that are involved in the discussion, know a lot about the CBGM because we generally tend to research a lot about what the scholars are saying because it has to do with our Bible, and it has to do with the Bibles that our friends and family read. So we read up on it because we're kind of in tune to these changes that are being made to the Bible, and we want to be able to communicate that to our friends and family who might be, have a moment in their life where they realize that something isn't right with their Bible. I've had multiple conversations where people will call me and they're doing, the modern critical method of reading multiple translations next to each other, and they realize these are different Bibles, all of them. And they call me freaking out because they know that I'm a crazy guy that studies this stuff, and I've had to walk them off ledges because, in some cases they're ready just to say, I give up. I don't, whatever, I don't care. So this is a very real thing. This is why TR advocates, in my opinion, are better studied in the subject. But in any case, I'm going to be using Tommy Wasserman and Peter Gurry's book, A New Approach to New Testament Textual Criticism, an Introduction to the Coherence-Based Genealogical Method, as a guide for this article. And I've also read Dr. Gurry's dissertation as well on the subject, and DC Parker's analysis, and there's a couple of other things I've read that you might see come through in this video. Anyway, some insights into the CBGM from the source material. So the New Testament textual criticism has a direct impact on preaching, commentaries, and how people read their Bible. Especially in the seminaries, they're teaching exegesis in a lot of cases as, new textual criticism as a part of exegesis, that you have to actually examine variants and determine the reading and do all this fancy footwork before you even get to the text. This is pretty, as I understand it, pretty common. And so this really does, it really impacts the way that students in seminary are going to learn how to do exegesis. So the stated goal of the CBGM is to help pastors, scholars, and lay people alike determine which text should be read, which should be applied. For the New Testament, this means trying to determine at each place where our copies disagree what the author most likely wrote, or failing this, at least what the earliest text might have been, end quote. And that's from page 1. Note that one of the stated objectives of the CBGM is to find what the author most likely wrote, and when that cannot be determined, what the earliest text might have been. And you'll notice this is kind of the common scholarly jargon, right? It's possible that, it's likely that, it may have been, it might be this way. There's never really, and this is the postmodern, humility of the scholars, where they don't want to make any sort of claims of certainty or confidence or anything like that, because that violates the sort of unspoken academic standard, which says there isn't really anything that's determinable, and that's where that comes from. So here's a brief definition of the CBGM as provided by Dr. Gurry and Wasserman. Quote, the CBGM is a method that 1, uses a set of computer tools, 2, based in a new way of relating manuscript text, that is 3, designed to help us understand the origin and history of the New Testament text, end quote, from page 3. The way that this method is relating manuscript text is an adaptation of Karl Lockman's common error method, as opposed to manuscript families and text types. So you've often heard people talk about different text families and text types and everything like that. That I mean, an easy way to put that is that kind of is from like a Westcott and Hort era of textual criticism, Metzger era text criticism, which people still use. I mean, there's people that still apply, and even in the CBGM, there's sort of application of those methods into the new system. But what's important to pull out from that is that the CBGM looks at individual texts as opposed to textual families. They kind of take the reading out of the manuscript and relate it not at a manuscript level necessarily, but at a textual variant level. So that's just it's a pretty big difference. And so this is in part due to, quote, a text of a manuscript may, of course, be much older than the parchment and ink that preserves it, end quote. Page 3. The CBGM is primarily concerned with developing genealogies, think of like a family tree, of readings and how variants relate to each other rather than how manuscripts relate to each other as a whole. This is done by using pre-genealogical, which is basically an algorithmic mathematical analysis, and genealogical, which is editorial analysis. So the person takes the math and makes a judgment. The method examines places where manuscripts agree and disagree to gain insight on which readings are earliest. In the case that the same place and two manuscripts disagree, the new method can help determine one of two things. One variant gave birth to the other, therefore one of them is earlier than the other. Two, the relationship between the variants is uncertain. We don't know how the variant got in the text. So think of it this way. Let's just use the ridiculous, the most Byzantine example, or like something where a manuscript agrees in 99% of the places, and there's let's just say unrealistically one single place where these manuscripts disagree. You can look at it and try to understand how that variant came into the text. Is it a similar word? Was it a scribal error or emendation? Was it a completely different concept? In other words, did they have a totally different set of manuscripts that maybe they brought it in from, or did the scribe take some malicious liberty to adjust it? So that's what it takes a look at. It's not. So you might even say that that one manuscript could be Alexandrian and another one might be kind of Alexandrian, using kind of old terminology, but they're not really talking in those terms anymore. They're basically looking at the variants, the places where the variants are, and trying to determine which variant came first, which is, as we'll talk about, kind of an impossible task. It is important to keep in mind that the CBGM is not simply a pure computer system, as you've probably heard. You've probably heard, well, it's science, it's computer science, it's math, it's, you can't make up the numbers. Things like this, it's just simply not true. And honestly, anyone that says that the CBGM is just hard, cold data, either A, doesn't understand the CBGM, or B, is being malicious and is lying to you and making an argument out of bad faith. So we really need to be careful about this method, because the way that it's getting smuggled into the church is basically it's being advertised by certain people, not by the scholars, albeit. The scholars don't have as much confidence as the apologists for the CBGM do, but it's going to get smuggled into the church basically under the guise that this is just science. And that's something that you're seeing all over the place today, right? Whether it be with the changing climate, whether it be with biological science, things like this, where people will gaslight you and just say, well, the science says this, the science is settled. Well, no. First of all, science is never settled. That's a part of the inquiry of the sciences. But anyone that uses, well, you're just anti-science, that's kind of a really big red flag. That means that someone is using an argument from authority to gaslight you. And this is oftentimes the kind of rhetoric we see within the text critical argument too. Well, no one agrees with you. There are no serious scholars that agree with you. Well, all the serious scholars could be wrong. Now, we have to actually examine the arguments and see if the arguments make sense, not whether or not the scholars think the arguments make sense. And that's what we got to do here, because as a side note, another tangent, I've become increasingly skeptical over the academic, the intelligentsia. I mean, it just seems that the further we get into this academic experiment with the universities going progressive and postmodern, it just seems like these scholars become more ridiculous in what they're saying. You have legitimate doctors from prestigious universities arguing against traditional maths, saying that 2 + 2 = 5. You have legitimate scientists and biologists who, against all the actual science, are talking through their butts, essentially, about things like basic biology, redefining terms, redefining things that used to be established and settled science, and in my opinion still are. But the point of all this is we have to be careful about how people use the term "it's just science" to kind of smuggle in a lot of things that are not scientifical, that are not demonstrated or supported by any sort of scientific methodology. So the CBGM is not pure science. It's not purely a computer system. It's not an artificial intelligence. It's not really even all that sophisticated. It requires user input and editorial judgment, which means that not only are the inputs going to give you a certain output, but the outputs that the machine kind of puts out then have to be judged again by the same person that put the inputs in. Further than that, as just someone who works at a senior level in the IT industry, all algorithms were made by human beings. Algorithms are not neutral in a lot of cases. So if an algorithm is looking for a specific thing, it's going to find that specific thing. Now, I haven't looked at the nuts and bolts of the CBGM, but I know people who at least have some sort of access to it, and from what they say, it's kind of rudimentary. It's not all that impressive. And if I know anything about the scholars that developed it, they're certainly not neutral, not in the slightest. So we have to be careful about this black box that we're putting our Bible into. We have to be very careful about what we're putting through this thing and what conclusions we draw based on our inputs in the algorithm and then the outputs. So we have to be critical thinkers here. We can't be so naive as to say this is a neutral methodology is what I'm getting at. Even computers can be biased because human beings code the software and the algorithms. So you have to be careful about that. So it requires user input and editorial judgment. Quote from the book. This means that the CBGM uses a unique combination of both objective and subjective data to relate text to each other. Later on it says, the CBGM requires the user to make his or her own decisions about how variant readings relate to each other, from page 4 and 5. That means that determining which variant came first, quote, is determined by the user of the method, not by the computer, end quote, from page 5. The CBGM is not purely a computer method. It's not purely science. It's not purely objectivity. People still determine which data to examine, which data to input using the computer tools, and ultimately what ends up in your printed texts, what ends up in the ECM, what ends up in any Greek New Testament is going to be the decisions of the editorial team. The computer just doesn't pump out and say, this is your Bible. It gives the people using this CBGM a bunch of options, and then they have to go and do their textual criticism, basically. So the average Bible reader should know that the CBGM, quote, has ushered in a number of changes to the most popular editions of the Greek New Testament and to the practice of New Testament textual criticism itself. Further down in the page, clearly these changes will affect not only modern Bible translations and commentaries, but possibly even theology in preaching, end quote, from page 5. Think about that for a second. Currently, the CBGM has been partially applied to the data in the Catholic epistles and Acts, and D.C. Parker, now retired, was leading a team that was working on the Gospel of John in the ECM. Now, the initial inquiry of this article was to examine the CBGM to determine if it indeed is a blessing to the church. In order for this to be the case, one would expect that this new method would introduce more certainty to Bible readers regarding variants. It would give us more confidence. It would prove our theory that, these set of texts are preserved. Unfortunately, the opposite seems to be true. Quote, along with the changes to the text just mentioned, there has also been a slight increase in the ECM editor's uncertainty about the text. For those unfamiliar to the discussion, the Editio Critica Maior is going to be basically a massive compendium of all the variants that they deem significant. That's the history of the textual variation of the New Testament in the manuscripts. So this is kind of where they're going to create this big, multi-voluminous set of volumes of variants, and then people making Greek New Testaments can kind of use that to create different Greek texts. So the ECM editors. So let me start this quote over again with that in mind and knowing what the ECM is. Along with the changes to the text just mentioned, there has also been a slight increase in the ECM editors' uncertainty about the text, an uncertainty that has been de facto adopted by the editors of the Nestle-Aland and United Bible Society texts. Later down on the page, their uncertainty is such that they refuse to offer any indication as to which reading they prefer, end quote. Sit in that for a second. I did. That when I read that for the first time and the second time and the third time and the fourth time, it really did worry me, obviously. Because this is being presented to people as having given us more certainty. This is being presented to us as a method that gives us more confidence, when the scholars that are using it are seemingly reporting the opposite, at least as reported by this text. Here's another quote on that point. In all, there were in the Catholic letters 32 uses of brackets compared to 43 uses of the diamond, and in Acts 78 cases of brackets compared to 155 diamonds. This means that there has been an increase in both number of places marked as uncertain and an increase in the level of uncertainty being marked. Overall, then, this reflects a slightly greater uncertainty about the earliest text on the part of the editors, end quote from page 7. And if you're unfamiliar, the black diamonds is basically a place where the editors said, we don't really know. We don't want to make a judgment. And then, which is why they're teaching in seminary, they're teaching in your church, they're teaching all the Bible readers. You've got to learn how to use your apparatus. You've got to learn how to judge on a variant, or else, in these future Bibles, you're kind of going to be a little bit up water with no paddle. And that's just the reality of it. What we're likely going to see, as we've seen, I believe, in a certain sense in the NASB 2021, is two textual variants in the actual main text of your Bible. And to most Christians, that's going to be really confusing for them. And they've done it with brackets, I believe, in the NASB 2020. But that we might get to a point where it's like the ECM, where they just have two lines of text, is a bad direction. Most people are not going to be able to know how to do that, how to read that, how to examine that, what even to do with a situation where there's textual variants in the main text. Most people can kind of ignore the footnotes at the bottom of the page, or not see them, or not know about them. This is going to be right in their face. So this uncertainty has resulted in, quote, the editors to abandon the concept of text types traditionally used to group and evaluate manuscripts, end quote from page 7. What this practically means is that the Alexandrian texts, which were formerly called a text type, are no longer considered to be a text type. The editors of the ECM, quote, still recognize the Byzantine text as a distinct text form in its own right. This is due to the remarkable agreement that one finds in our late Byzantine manuscripts. Their agreement is such that it is hard to deny that they should be grouped. Later on in down the page, when the CBGM was first used on the Catholic letters, the editors found that a number of Byzantine witnesses were surprisingly similar to their own reconstructed text. End quote from page 9 and 10. So there's a couple of things on that point. The Alexandrian text type is no longer properly a text type. Now, you could still use the term Alexandrian manuscript because everyone kind of knows what you're talking about, but they aren't uniform enough to really be considered a text family, not directly at least. You have kind of within what's called the Alexandrian text platform, sort of cousin manuscripts perhaps, but there's such wide disagreement within the places of textual variation within the Alexandrian manuscripts that it's irresponsible to say that they're a text family, unlike the Byzantine manuscripts where they're, in some cases, 99% uniform. So that's an interesting development you probably didn't know about. And because, in large part, irresponsible apologists and irresponsible people that don't really know a lot about the discussion are still using terminology from 10, 20 years ago. So Along with abandoning the notion that the Alexandrian manuscripts represent a text type, another significant shift has occurred. Rather than pursuing what has historically been called the divine original, or the original text, or the authorial text, the editors of the ECM are now after what is called the initial text, or in German, Ausgangstext. There are various ways this term is defined, but opinions are split with the editors of the ECM. For example, D.C. Parker and those that are kind of in his school of thinking, this is the man who was leading the team in the ECM for the Gospel of John, has stated along with others that there is no good reason to believe that the initial text and the original text are the same. This is, I would say, the overwhelming sentiment in New Testament textual criticism. Others are more optimistic, but the 198 diamonds in Acts and the Catholic letters may serve as an indication as to whether this optimism is warranted based on the data. The diamonds indicate a place where the reading is uncertain, and the scholars don't want to make a judgment call on it. So this is kind of the apologetic from the evangelical textual scholars. They say, I have no reason to believe that the initial text and the original text are any different. Well, first of all, that's not honest, because the fact that they won't say this is original proves that they don't actually believe that. I really wish they would stop saying that, because they don't actually believe that. The computer-based component of the CBGM is often sold as a conclusive means to determine the earliest or even original reading. This is just not true. Quote, at best, pre-genealogical coherence, that's the computer part of the model, only tells us how likely it is that a variant had multiple sources of origin rather than just one. Later on in the page, pre-genealogical coherence is only one piece of the text-critical puzzle. The other pieces, knowledge of scribal tendencies, the date and quality of manuscripts, versions, patristic citations, and the author's theology, are still required. Further down the page even more, as with so much textual criticism, there are no absolute rules here, and experience serves as the best guide. You guys, do you feel like you've been gaslit by a lot of people? Because modern textual criticism has the only consistent methodology, right? How many times have you heard that? How many times have you heard? Let me just read this. As with so much textual criticism, there are no absolute rules here. And in fact, your experience serves as your best guide. So let's just think about that for just a moment. And I'm sure that if you have watched a lot of James White, for example, this is causing you some issues in your head. Because you're saying, you've heard for years and years and years, we have a consistent methodology. No, you don't. There's nothing consistent about modern New Testament textual criticism. Nothing at all. Notice, let me just harp on something real quick. Knowledge of scribal tendencies. There's Jim Royce wrote a really, really expansive volume on the topic, which I think was a great contribution that essentially nobody in the church has access to, because it's, first of all, too expensive, second of all, no one knows about it, third of all, it's too technical for a lot of people to read. But what people do with scribal tendencies, this is how it practically works out, is they basically start conjecturing on behalf of the scribe. Well, the scribe must have done this. The scribe was actually doing this. It's like, you do not know what the scribe was actually doing. You can speculate, but this is just knowledge of scribal tendencies is such an interesting concept. It basically allows the textual scholar to say, this is what was actually happening. The scribe was copying from a footnote, right? The date and quality of manuscripts. Well, what determines quality of manuscripts? The so-called Alexandrian manuscripts are the most terribly, they have the most terrible quality of almost any manuscripts we have. They're just old and therefore determined higher quality. What he's essentially saying, the other pieces are entirely subjective and entirely up to the opinion of the editor. So there are no absolute rules here, according to the scholars. So let's carry on. In the past, it has been said that textual criticism was trying to build a 10,000 piece puzzle with 10,100 pieces. In other words, we have too many pieces to fit the puzzle, therefore all the materials there, we just got to kind of fit it into the puzzle. This perspective has changed greatly since the introduction of the CBGM. Quote, We are trying to piece together a puzzle with only some of the pieces, end quote, from page 112. Not only does the CBGM not have all the data that has ever existed, or even all the data that exists today, it is only using about, quote, 1/3 of our extant Greek manuscripts. The significance of this selectivity of our evidence means that our textual flow diagrams and global stemma do not give us a picture of exactly what happened, end quote, from page 113. So anyone that tells you that the CBGM is like this, this incredible super machine, no. First of all, we have 1/3 of the data that exists today in the CBGM. Most of it tends to be biased towards what the textual scholars already believed. So for example, for the most part, it excludes the later manuscripts. It's mostly looking at the manuscripts they already believed to be the best and earliest. So that's what I mean by inputs are kind of important. Further, the CBGM is not omniscient. It will never know how many of the more complex corruptions entered the manuscripts, or the backgrounds and the theology of the scribes, or even the purpose a manuscript was created. Quote, there are still cases where contamination can go undetected in the CBGM, with the result that proper ancestor-descendant relationships are inverted, end quote, from page 115. That means that it's likely that there will be readings that make it into your Bible produced by the CBGM that are not original, not earliest, but will be said to be early and original, or original. Quote, we do not want to give the impression that the CBGM has solved the problem of contamination once and for all. The CBGM still faces certain problematic scenarios, and the loss of witnesses plagues all methods at some point, end quote, from page 115. So that's, first of all, 2 points on that. The first point is that's the general opinion, I think, of most scholars that are using the CBGM. They're in a lot of cases that I've seen, very critical of some of its flaws, and they recognize its limitations. The problem is the people that are apologists for the modern critical text that just kind of make these really unfounded assertions about how the CBGM is God's gift to the church and how it's perfect and it's going to get us to 125 AD. Come on. The scholars aren't even saying that. The scholars are not even saying that. So, what the author of this text is basically saying is that in the case where there's a diamond, right, where the reading can go either way, the editor of your Bible, in effect, could pick the wrong reading and actually give you a later reading that is not original and think that it is original and tell you that it is original. There's no way of determining. That's why I say this all the time. I quote Dan Wallace. Even if we had the original, we wouldn't know it. We wouldn't know it. There's no way to validate those results, which makes it purely conjectural. Supported by data, but in terms of arriving to a conclusion, conjectural. One of the impending realities that the CBGM has created is that there may be a push for, and we're already seeing this, individual users, Bible readers, to learn how to use and implement the CBGM at a daily devotional level. Quote, providing a customizable option would mean creating a version that allows each user to have his or her own editable database, end quote, from page 119 and 120. There will likely be a time in the near future where the average Bible reading Christian will be encouraged to understand and use the CBGM, at least pastors and seminarians will, at a practical level. And so if you're not somebody that has the time or ability to do this, to understand a complex methodology and to implement use a computer tool that maybe is hard to use, this really seems like it could be a burden, like a big burden. Further, the concept of a build-your-own Bible tool seems like a pretty slippery slope, and we're already there, but this just kind of streamlines the process. So that's not the right direction for unity. I can only see that causing issues in the church. So since the CBGM has not been fully implemented, I suppose there's no way to say with absolute confidence whether or not it's a blessing to the church, right? But what we have seen so far seems to indicate that it's not. I believe the church should be the one to decide this matter, not the scholars, not the apologists. I think the average layperson should have access to what's going on at a very lay level, and they should be the ones to determine, hey, do we agree with this methodology? Do we endorse this methodology? Do we want to fund this methodology? Do we want this methodology coming into our church in new Bible versions? I think they should be the ones to have the say, but they don't even know this is going on in most cases. And those that do believe that it's just this beautiful, immaculate, miraculous gift from God that floated down on high, and it's just a miracle to the church because of irresponsible apologists. It seems that the places where the CBGM has already been implemented have spoken quite loudly on the matter, at least in 198 places where it says we don't know the reading here, providing a greater level of uncertainty than the previous editions. Hopefully, this has been insightful to you, helpful to you, and perhaps has shed some light on the claims that many are parroting, which say that the CBGM is just a blessing of the church. It can get us to 125 AD. If anything, the increasing amount of uncertainty that the CBGM has introduced to the previous efforts of modern textual criticism should give cause for us to pause for a second, because the Bibles that most people use are based on methodologies that modern scholarship has either abandoned or updated or stopped using. Which is a whole conversation in itself. You know, you have all these scholars basically saying, this is the new methodology. These old Bibles were used on the old methodology. We think that methodology was stale and not necessarily accurate, but hey, we're going to let all the Bibles just kind of remain after being used, after being developed with that methodology. That's a whole nother conversation. Basically, the methodology is said to be antiquated, yet all of our Bibles, our modern Bibles, still have that methodology all over it. I mean, this is a mess. This is a mess. The CBGM is not God's gift to the church. It's going to introduce far more chaos than any benefit it could ever provide. The one silver lining of the CBGM is that once they make it more available to people, hopefully we'll be able to insert data sets that kind of test some of our theories on variance. You know, we might be able to use the system with proper input to get some more. And I've already done this. There's actually a textual clusters tool on the page on the INTF website, which allows you to kind of play around with the pre-genealogical coherence, the mathematical computer portion of it. They've uploaded data sets that anyone can use, the sort of outputs of the CBGM on the mathematical side, and you can see there is barely any relationship between Vaticanus and P75, as James White loves to claim. The CBGM does not say that. It says the opposite. So the CBGM can be good when understood as to when you understand what it is and what it isn't. What it is an algorithmic computer model on the front end that allows us to see how much a manuscript agrees in certain places with another manuscript in certain places, or a number of manuscripts in certain places. It is not a tool that tells you what the original is or gives any information about the original. The CBGM is agnostic to the original. Doesn't care, can't determine, has nothing to do with the original. And this, as far as this 125 AD thing, it's crock. It's dishonest. It's not accurate. So that has been it. I know I kind of took a lot of time from you. I know some people like longer format podcasts, and that's kind of what I was going with this. I took my article and commented a lot. So maybe in the comments tell me if you liked that better, or if you just want me to stick to the nuts and bolts and just read my articles. Shut up, Taylor. We don't want to hear you talk all that much about, you know, your pet little projects. Let me know. Let me know if you just want me to read the straight articles or if you like the commentary. Anyway, this has been the Christ and Culture Podcast with Taylor DeSoto. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and we will see you in the next video coming up in the next couple of days. Thanks, guys.